If you want her, you'll have to go through me. The words shot through the air like a rifle crack, louder than the dozens of weapons pointed from both sides of the riverbank. On one side, a wall of painted Apache warriors, arrows knocked and silent as death. On the other, settlers with tight jaws and fingers resting on rifle triggers, dust still rising behind their boots. In the middle stood Dakota, bare-chested, blood trickling from a cut on his brow, arms outstretched to shield the girl behind him. Clara Whitmore, the settler's daughter who should have been his enemy, the woman he'd come to love. Her hand clutched his shirt from behind, trembling but not retreating. The wind held its breath, and time, for just a second, folded in on itself. What happened next would change the land, the families, and two nations forever. But to understand this moment, you have to go back to the girl who wandered too close to the river and the man whose life was never supposed to cross hers. Clara Whitmore was not the kind of girl the town expected her to be. Born the only daughter of William Whitmore, a former Army officer turned cattle rancher, she was raised on the brittle edge of Apache territory in the Arizona frontier. Her mother, Ruth, had died of fever the previous winter, and with her went the last traces of softness in Clara's world. Left alone with a father who measured virtue by silence and obedience, Clara was expected to marry, settle, and bear sons, to anchor the Whitmore name into the land. But Clara's heart beat to a different rhythm. While her father and older brother Thomas carved fences into the earth and spoke of expansion, Clara wandered further from the homestead each day, past the corral, past the brittle mesquite trees, down to the river that wound like a secret through the landscape. It was there she found something the settlement never offered, stillness. And it was there she first saw him. He wasn't supposed to be there. The man by the river was sprawled, half hidden behind the reeds, his shoulder bloodied, his breathing shallow. A warrior, unmistakably Apache, with jet black hair matted to his face and a necklace of bone and turquoise rising and falling on his chest. Clara froze. Every story she'd ever heard warned of this moment. Burning cabins, stolen children, women taken in the night. Her father had drilled it into her, like scripture, if you see one you run, or shoot. But he wasn't charging. He wasn't even conscious. He was bleeding out beneath the cottonwoods, the river lapping inches from his fingertips. She should have walked away, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the blood had soaked into the earth. Maybe it was the way his fingers twitched faintly, as if clinging to life by a thread. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the unbearable knowledge that no one, settler or Apache, should die alone. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. Burning. With trembling fingers, she brought her water skin to his lips. He didn't drink at first, but when he did, it was with a breath so fragile it felt like glass in her hands. Clara stayed until the sun dropped low behind the cliffs, hidden from the eyes of her father, from the world that would have branded her a traitor. She didn't speak. Neither did he. She left him there, in the shadows, uncertain if he would survive the night, but he did. The next evening, Clara returned, unsure why. A part of her hoped he'd be gone. Another part feared he'd be dead. Instead, she found him sitting upright, his wound wrapped in bark and fiber. He looked at her with dark eyes that didn't blink, didn't soften. She expected anger, distrust. What she found instead was curiosity and gratitude. Why? He asked softly. She had no answer. They met again the next night, and the one after that. He told her his name was Dakota, son of Gray Wolf, raised to track the stars and listen to the wind. She told him about the ranch, about her mother's hymn book, and how her father wanted her to marry Edgar Boone, a man whose boots were always too clean and whose smile never reached his eyes. They sat on opposite sides of the river at first, then close enough to touch. Under the wide Arizona sky, something bloomed between them that neither could name. It was not born of logic or need or even rebellion. It simply was. But the land does not forget its wounds, and neither do the people who bleed into it. Even as Clara's world grew larger, freer, under the stars beside Dakota, shadows stirred behind her. Her brother Thomas began to ask questions. Her father's scowl grew darker with every ride she took alone. Meanwhile, Dakota's disappearance each evening had not gone unnoticed. Apache scouts reported tracks near settler land. Gray Wolf summoned his son, demanded answers he refused to give. It was only a matter of time, and time in the frontier has teeth. The river became their sanctuary, Each evening, as the sun slipped behind the jagged cliffs and painted the sky in hues of copper and indigo, Clara would ride alone with no saddle and no permission, her fingers clenched around the reins of the old gray mare she had broken herself. She always arrived before Dakota, always waited, and always felt her pulse quicken when she heard the soft crackle of leaves behind her, the unmistakable rhythm of his footsteps moving through the brush, stealthy, smooth, never hurried. At first they barely spoke. Words felt fragile, unnecessary. They sat close, sharing silence like an old language, broken only by wind and water. But as the weeks passed, the silence cracked open. She asked about the beads around his neck, each one carved by hand, representing a moment, a promise, a scar. He asked about the gold ring she wore on a ribbon tucked beneath her blouse. It had been her mother's, the only thing not taken by fever. They began trading truths, one small piece at a time, like passing tokens across a fragile bridge. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked one night, after telling her how his cousin had been killed by settlers last spring, shot while gathering herbs 2 ridges away. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm more afraid of becoming the woman my father expects me to be." That answer changed something. Dakota began showing her things, the healing roots that grew under ash trees, how to read wind direction from the shape of the leaves, the stars that marked safe paths, and the one that always pointed home. In return, Clara brought him books, pages torn carefully from the Bible, from a weathered almanac, from her mother's hymn book. He couldn't read, not yet, but he memorized the sounds she made, her voice soft against the firefly dark. And though they never touched, not hands, not lips, there was a gravity between them stronger than law, blood, or tradition. But gravity is dangerous when the world is stacked against you. Back at the Whitmore Ranch, suspicion grew like rot beneath painted wood. Thomas had tracked her once, found hoofprints leading toward the Apache boundary. He said nothing to her but told their father. William Whitmore didn't confront Clara directly. Instead, he tightened the reins in quiet ways, demanding she stay close to the house, forbidding nighttime rides, assigning Edgar Boone to watch over her. Clara knew what Edgar really was, a leash. He was the kind of man who believed women were investments and the land was currency. He had already spoken to her father about marriage. She had overheard it, standing at the top of the stairs, listening to her life being bartered like cattle. Meanwhile, Dakota's absence had stirred unrest in his own camp. Gray Wolf, wise but unbending, had raised Dakota to honor the Apache way, survival through unity, strength through tradition. But love for an outsider? That was weakness, that was betrayal. When confronted, Dakota didn't lie, he didn't flinch. "She gave me water," he told his father. "She gave me life when the earth tried to take it." Gray Wolf looked at him long and cold. "She will cost you your people." But Dakota already knew, he could feel it, how something inevitable was pressing in from all sides, and it came sooner than either of them expected. One evening, as Clara approached the river, she sensed it. The air felt wrong, no birdsong, no breeze. Her mare snorted uneasily, hooves shuffling against dry ground, and then steel flashed behind a cottonwood. Thomas stepped out, rifle slung over his shoulder, Edgar Boone 2 steps behind. "Thought I'd find you here," Thomas said, eyes fixed on the path behind her. Clara's heart lurched. "I was riding," she said stiffly, keeping her voice steady. "It's just a river." Edgar sneered. "Not just a river, sweetheart, a line. You've been crossing it." Behind them, Dakota emerged from the trees, silent as shadow. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't speak. Just met Clara's eyes and waited. Thomas saw it, the connection, the silent thread between them that no bullet could sever. "You've disgraced our name," he muttered. "No," Clara said quietly, stepping forward. "I've reclaimed it." Edgar reached for her arm. She jerked away, and that's when the world ignited. From the far bank, 4 Apache warriors materialized like ghosts, bows drawn, eyes burning. Dakota raised one hand, signaling them to hold. On the settler side, more men emerged from the trees, William Whitmore among them, jaw set, pistol in hand. In a matter of seconds, 2 worlds stood inches from war. Dakota moved first. Slowly, deliberately, he walked into the no-man's land between the 2 groups, and Clara followed. They stood together, back to back, surrounded by hatred older than their names. "She is not your enemy," Dakota said, voice low but clear. William leveled the pistol. "You've turned my daughter into a disgrace." Clara's voice cracked open. "No, father. You turned me into a prisoner. I chose my freedom." On the Apache side, Gray Wolf's voice rang out, "Dakota, if you cross this line, you are no longer my son." Dakota didn't hesitate. "Then I will build a new name, one not poisoned by fear." And then, the standoff broke. A settler gun fired first. An Apache arrow answered. Chaos erupted like thunder. Horses screamed, dust swirled. Clara felt the burn of pain, a slash across her shoulder, but stood her ground. Dakota pulled her behind him just as an arrow meant for her embedded in his side. He staggered but didn't fall. Clara screamed his name. The river roared, and in that moment, with smoke in the air and betrayal on both sides, Clara Whitmore raised her father's fallen rifle and pointed it at the man who raised her. "Step back," she whispered, voice steel, "or I swear to God I will end this myself." The rifle in Clara's hands felt heavier than iron, hotter than fire. Her finger rested on the trigger, but it was more than metal that shook. It was everything she'd ever believed, everything that had ever been forced upon her. William Whitmore stood 10 paces away, stunned, his hand frozen above the pistol holstered at his belt. The daughter he'd raised to kneel and obey was now standing between him and the enemy, barrel leveled at his chest, fury burning in her bloodied face. Behind her, Dakota knelt with one hand pressed against his side, blood seeping fast through the leather at his ribs. Still, he looked up at her, not with panic, not with pain, but with awe, as if she was no longer the girl he met by the river, but something forged from lightning. "No more," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. "No more hate. No more walls. No more killing in the name of land that was never yours to take." "Clara," her father said, voice strangled, "put that gun down." But the gun didn't waver. "I begged you," she said, "to let me choose. You wouldn't, so now I choose this. I choose him." For a long moment no one moved. Dust swirled between the two lines like smoke from a dying fire. Then Gray Wolf lowered his bow. One by one, the Apache warriors followed, but the settlers didn't move. Edgar Boone spat into the dirt. "You're siding with savages now?" he growled. Dakota's voice, hoarse but firm, cut through the silence. "The only savage I see is the one who came here to kill. That was enough." Edgar raised his pistol. Clara reacted on instinct. One shot cracked the air. Edgar's weapon dropped from his hand. Blood bloomed on his shoulder as he screamed and fell backward. Clara stood frozen, smoke still rising from her rifle. Thomas lunged toward her. "You've lost your damn mind." But William held out an arm, stopping his son mid-step. "Enough," the old man said, eyes never leaving Clara's. "Let her go." "But father—" Thomas started. "She's not ours anymore," William said, and in his voice was something hollow, not rage, not fear, something far worse, acceptance. He turned. The other settlers hesitated, then followed. The line broke. Across the river, Gray Wolf approached Dakota. His face was stone, his eyes ancient. "You've chosen your path," he said. Dakota nodded through the pain. "I have." Gray Wolf stared at him for a long time, then at Clara, then "Walk it well." He turned without another word, melting into the trees with his warriors, and just like that, it was over. Clara dropped the rifle and dropped to her knees beside Dakota. His skin was cold. The arrow wound deep. Her hands fluttered uselessly over the blood, pressing, praying. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please, stay." He looked at her, pale but smiling. "You didn't run." "I never will," she said, her tears falling into the dirt. With one arm he pulled her close. She held his face, whispering his name again and again as he slipped into unconsciousness. They had no home now, no tribe, no safety, only each other. The journey into the mountains took 3 days. Clara guided the mare with Dakota slumped in the saddle, his head resting against her chest, fever burning through his skin. She found an old canyon trail her father had once shown her, abandoned, overgrown, far from any town, any patrol. At night she built fires with trembling hands and fed him broth from her mother's tin cup. She sang old hymns, voice cracking from cold and exhaustion, the same way her mother had sung during long winters when Clara was too young to understand grief. On the 4th morning, she found the valley, a narrow basin nestled between sheer cliffs, surrounded by pines and stone and silence. A stream bubbled through its center. Elk tracks crisscrossed the mossy edges. It felt untouched, forgotten, sacred. "This is it," she whispered. "It would have to be." Clara built the shelter herself, logs stripped and notched, tied with rope made from torn linens. She stacked stones for a hearth, rigged a lean-to with hides stolen from the ranch before she fled. Every day she checked the wound, cleaned it, spoke to him as if he were awake. "You can't leave me now," she said one night, his breath shallow beneath her fingers. "You made me brave, so now you have to see it through." And then, on the seventh day, he opened his eyes. At first he only whispered her name, then, "Where are we?" She smiled through her tears. "Home." He tried to sit up, winced. "You built this?" "With your stubbornness and my rage," she joked, "mostly rage." He laughed, then groaned. "I think you broke a rib." "You'll live," she said, kissing his forehead. And he did. The seasons changed. Snow came and they survived it. Spring returned and wildflowers painted the valley in color. Clara planted rows of corn and beans. Dakota carved new arrows, taught her how to track, to snare, to hear danger in silence. They didn't speak of the world they left behind, only of what came next. One day she woke to find a new carving hanging above their doorway, a circle of wood, split clean down the middle, bound again by leather and iron nails. "What is it?" she asked. "Our story," he said. She traced it with her fingers. "You should give it a name." He looked at her. "I already did." She smiled. "Let me guess. Fire and thunder?" "No," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Clara." And that night, under the stars, she kissed him not like a secret, but like a vow, a love forged in defiance, a life built from the ashes of two empires. And in that valley, far from the world's expectations, Dakota and Clara finally became free. By the time the second winter came, Clara no longer flinched at the howl of wolves or the sudden crash of wind against the timber walls. Her hands were blistered but skilled. She knew how to salt meat, mend hide, and braid rope from creek-washed hemp. The land had carved itself into her, not gently but faithfully. The girl who once wore silk corsets and embroidered gloves now moved with the confidence of someone who trusted the rhythm of a world without clocks. Dakota healed slowly. The arrow had missed his lung by inches, but the scar it left was deep, purple, and jagged, a mark Clara touched every night before sleep, as if to remind herself that she hadn't imagined his survival. He would sit by the fire, fletching arrows with obsidian tips, his fingers moving with quiet precision. Sometimes he would watch her read aloud from the tattered pages she'd saved in her saddlebag, the Bible, a book of poems, and her mother's hymn book. He didn't always understand the words, but he said her voice turned them into something holy. They didn't speak much about the lives they'd left behind. Not at first. The pain was still raw, like stepping barefoot through ash that hadn't finished smoldering. But one evening, as snow began to fall in slow spirals outside their cabin window, Clara asked softly, "Do you miss them?" Dakota stared into the fire for a long while before answering. "I miss the sound of my father's voice when he wasn't a chief, just a man. I miss the smell of roasted maize during the harvest. And I miss my sister, Singing Bird. She used to braid feathers into my hair when I was small." Clara reached for his hand. "Tell me about her." So he did. And then he asked about Ruth, her mother, about the way she used to sing while baking, about how she taught Clara to draw birds in the dust with a twig, and told her that a woman could love fiercely and still stand tall. It was the first time Clara cried in months, and Dakota held her so quietly, so completely, she swore she could hear the river outside pause to listen. As the days stretched into years, their lives folded into something not perfect but sacred. They built a second shelter, a smokehouse tucked between boulders. They tamed 2 wild horses. And in the summer of their 3rd year, Clara felt something shift inside her. A sickness at first, then a flutter, then the unmistakable knowing. She waited 3 days before telling him, not out of fear but wonder. She wanted to be sure it was real. When she did, Dakota didn't speak. He simply fell to his knees, pressed his ear gently against her belly, and whispered something in Apache that she didn't understand but felt bloom beneath her skin, like sunlight in spring. They named her Lila, after the evening star that first appeared the night Clara gave birth beneath a canopy of pine boughs and prayer. She came into the world with a loud cry and a full head of black curls, fists clenched and ready. Dakota wept openly, and Clara did too, not from pain but from the overwhelming truth that somehow, in a world that wanted them dead or divided, they had created life. Lila grew fast. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She learned to walk on moss and stone, to speak both English and Apache in the same breath, and to feed deer from her palm with a patience neither of her parents possessed. And then one spring, travelers came, 3 riders from the east, lost and starving. Clara spotted them first from the ridge. Dakota watched with caution, his bow never lowering. But when one of the men collapsed beside the stream, Clara didn't hesitate. She ran down the hill barefoot, Lila clinging to her back. They gave the men water, bread, a bed of furs beside the fire. The youngest of them, barely 20, watched Dakota with wide eyes, and when asked his name, stammered. My father spoke of a man, Apache but different. Said he vanished after a blood feud with settlers. Said he saved a girl who turned on her own people. Clara looked at Dakota. He said nothing. The men stayed one night, then left, promising silence and respect. Clara wasn't sure if the promise would hold, but she no longer feared being found. Because if they were found, it meant their story hadn't died. It meant someone had remembered love over hate. Years passed. The valley became more than a refuge. It became a home. Others eventually came not to take, but to ask. Misfits, widows, those who had no place among their own, and slowly, quietly, a new kind of settlement grew. No fences, no flags, just firelight and children with mixed blood and ancient names. When Lila turned 10, she planted a tree by the river, a cottonwood, the same kind that once shaded her mother and father's first meeting place. Dakota helped her dig the hole. Clara tied a ribbon, her mother's, from her own hair around the young sapling. They said no words because none were needed. Years later, when they were gone and the valley became legend, travelers would speak of that cottonwood, of how it grew strong and tall even when wind and storm tried to rip it out by the roots, of how it bent but never broke, how it stood between 2 cliffs, not choosing one side but embracing both. Some say that's where love was born again, not in churches, not in treaties, but in a valley with no name, between a girl who refused to obey and a warrior who refused to hate. Years later, no map would ever mark the valley where Clara Whitmore and Dakota built their life. No monument would bear their names, and yet travelers would still speak of them, in whispers, in stories passed over fires, in the eyes of children who looked like 2 nations woven into one. They called it the Cottonwood Valley, not because anyone claimed it, but because of the tree. The one that grew out of soil stained by blood and silence. The one that bent in windstorms but never snapped. The one planted by a child born from forbidden love. Proof that even when history tries to bury something, the roots remember. Clara and Dakota's story wasn't supposed to happen. Everything was against them: bloodlines, language, religion, family, law. They were told they could never belong to each other, that to love across that line meant betrayal, meant shame, meant war. And still, they chose each other, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And that's where this story becomes something more than a tale of the past. Because this is not just a story about a settler girl and an Apache warrior. This is about what happens when 2 people dare to look past what the world has told them to fear. This is about the cost of compassion, the weight of legacy, and the terrifying, beautiful power of choice. Let's be honest, most people wouldn't have made the choice Clara made. She gave up everything: her family, her name, her safety. She was called a traitor. She faced a gun pointed by her own father. And yet, she didn't back down. Why? Because she finally realized survival means nothing if you're not living in truth. And Dakota? He didn't ask her to change. He didn't try to make her forget her past. He simply stood beside her, wound and all, and offered silence where others offered noise, and presence where others offered control. He lost his tribe, his title, even his father's respect. But in Clara's arms, he found a new kind of peace, one that didn't need to be named to be real. So what do we take from this? That love is not a fairy tale. It's not always grand gestures and whispered poetry under the stars. Sometimes love is hiding in the dirt, bleeding beside a riverbank. Sometimes it's chopping firewood in silence. Sometimes it's holding your partner's hand while the whole world tries to pull you apart. And most importantly, sometimes love is choosing the harder path, because it's the only one that leads to freedom. But don't let this ending fool you. The cost didn't vanish with time. Clara still carried the ache of her mother's absence, the sting of her father's rejection. Dakota still felt the ghosts of his ancestors each time he watched settlers encroach on sacred land. And Lila, their daughter, grew up knowing she would never fully belong to either world. But they gave her something far greater than belonging. They gave her truth. A life built not on compromise, but on conviction. A place where she could speak in two tongues, wear two names, and never feel like either made her less whole. So I ask you now, would you have done what Clara did? Would you have pointed a rifle at your own father to protect someone the world called enemy? Would you have walked away from the only life you knew for a love that had no place in it? Or would you have stayed quiet, safe, obedient? The truth is, most people won't say it out loud, but they're afraid. Afraid to cross that line. Afraid to love boldly. Afraid of what people will think. But here's the thing. The world only changes when someone dares to disobey. So maybe the question isn't, would you have done what Clara did? Maybe the real question is, what line are you still too afraid to cross? Because we all have one. Maybe yours isn't between Apache and settler. Maybe it's between what your parents expect and what your heart craves. Between safety and freedom. Between the person you pretend to be and the one you're aching to become. And if this story stirred something in you, good. That means you're still listening, still open, still willing to imagine a world where love is not defined by race, law, or blood, but by choice. And that choice is yours. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone you once loved or still love, leave a comment below. We read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make your heart race, your eyes sting, and your soul remember. Because love like theirs, it doesn't end with a gunshot. It begins when you finally say, I choose you, even when the world says I shouldn't.